Like a number of other Scot Club stalwarts, however, he has a tendency to hide his light under a bushel. I forgot that the right way around, I often worry. His light under a bushel. And it was only recently at council, when we were discussing possibilities for this year's programme, that I discovered he was a live performer in a successful Scottish folk group. Martin also has an academic side, completing a PhD on the works of Alan Massey, partly in the light of Scott, and he teaches 20th century literature for the Open University and Scottish and English literature at the University of Edinburgh. He's published on James Robertson's novels and spoken to the club in the past on Robertson and Scott. Douglas Kay, as Martin himself modestly puts it, is even more engaged on musical projects and has toured extensively with a number of fine albums to his credit and airplay on BBC Scotland. He's a qualified primary school teacher, teaches part-time and tours around some of the schools in Edinburgh giving, and I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly, Burren. Am I lessons? That's a drum, a sort of Irish drum, I believe. The Sorries group was formed over 10 years ago. Their first live show was in Edinburgh in December 2006, and the title was chosen consciously to reflect an admiration of the Irish group, the Corries. Though not necessarily at a time of great consciousness on their own part, there being some uncertainty as to whether the decision was taken over a bottle of whiskey on the beach at Garside or at Ullapool. They now have a number of albums under their belt, and 2017, later this year, will see their 9th year at the festival, with a run of daily performances at 4:30 in the afternoon over 3 weeks at the Quaker Meeting House. Recently, they've been advancing their interest in the tradition of Scottish songwriting and have begun a series of podcasts, the Scottish Song Guide, where they discuss the meanings and history of both words and music of some of the most famous pieces in their repertoire, interspersed with snippets from the songs themselves. Something of this order, I understand, lies in wait for us tonight, mostly focused on the songs of Walter Scott, whose output and significance in this field matches that of Burns and Hogg, though this is sometimes obscured by the multifariousness of his other activities. Just one more thing before we start about the sound equipment here. Some of you will have seen Lee over there assembling it. A very complicated business it looked. And a lot of the equipment tonight is his own equipment, personal equipment. And I think we ought to acknowledge that without his unfailing and invaluable input, it wouldn't be possible at all for the club to host, certainly not so professionally, events such as this. And now, without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, the Sorries.
So there's going to be a certain amount of shuffling back and forth here, so you'll have to forgive us for that. Thank you, Peter. This is we're going to tell you a bit of the story of Scott's songs. The title "The Story" is chosen quite consciously, because some of it, in some cases, it is the stories behind them. What we're going to do is give you a background to some of Scott's lyrics. Scott didn't write the music. He didn't write any music, as far as I know. And so we're going to give a bit of a background, a rundown on the creation of Scott's lyrics. Some taken from Scott's own notes, pieced together from some of Scott's diary entries and letters, and in some cases the historical context of the writing and of the events that are being depicted in the song. It should be said at this stage probably that a load of what we've been researching now, in fact our job was made an awful lot easier. The resources online now, which are partially the result of some of the work of some members of this club, like Peter and others. There's the resources in the Edinburgh University website, and there's resources also in terms of the minstrelsy, a teaching website I think it's called. There's some fantastic stuff out there. If you're even vaguely interested, it's highly accessible and really interesting. Yeah, and also as part of this we're going to give you also a history of the tunes, maybe playing some of the older versions of the tunes, or certainly discussing them and how Scott found them, where he took them from. So we've decided to play 4 or 5 songs depending on how much time we get, and we've kind of loosely picked them because A couple of them come from the minstrelsy of the Scottish Borders, which was, well, the first edition's 1802, the third edition's 1806, but we'll get to that later. There were songs written for other publications, songs from within Scott's longer works, and songs which Scott wrote on a frisk, as he put it. The problem with this is that as soon as you actually insert actual songs into these lovely categories, the categories completely collapse. So we're going to talk about the Queen's Mary and Lord Randall from the minstrelsy. Queen's Mary was from the third edition, Lord Randall's from the second. Songs written for other publications, I think it was Albine's Anthology, it was Jock of Hazeldean. You have songs from Scott's longer works, Blue Bonnets is in his novel The Monastery, and songs written on a frisk was how he described his writing of Bonnie Dundee. Of course, Bonnie Dundee is also in the Doom of Devergoyle, and also was published in another publication. Blue Bonnets is taken from something that appears in the minstrelsy, and so it goes on, so the categories completely fall apart. But I like the categories, so I left them in. We're going to play you some music in just a minute, but just to give you a little bit of further context to what we're talking about, I thought it would be useful to know the kind of sources we've got. In some cases they were known to Scott, in some cases of course not. The Skene manuscript is from around about 1615, but it wasn't rediscovered until much later in Scott's career, so that's not that relevant. Ramsay's Tea Table, Miscellany and the Evergreen obviously are there, Orpheus Caledonius, Oswald's Pocket Companion, we'll talk a little bit more about it later. The Scots Musical Museum, Burns was a big contributor to that, of course. Minstrelsy of the Borders, of course. Albine's Anthology, Alexander Campbell was supposedly Scott's music teacher, according to the wonderfully named critic Charles Zug. You have Hogg's Jacobite Relics, Scottish Songs, Ancient Scottish Melodies from a manuscript of the reign of King James VI.
Which refers back to the Skene manuscript as well.
Yeah, and Lyric Gems of Scotland, and it goes on. Of course, many of these are post-date Scott, so these are our sources for trying to get at where Scott got his material from. Songs of Scotland prior to Burns with tunes is useful. English and Scottish popular ballads is the kind of seminal work on the ballad in Scotland, in particular. And Bertrand Bronson worked on that and reinserted the tunes because Child never put the tunes in. So the tunes are kind of reinserted by Bronson, so he's been a very useful source for us. And then Kinsley's Oxford Book of Ballads has been kind of handy too. So, without much further ado, I think we'll get on to the Queen's Mary.
Yeah, why not? Do you want to?
I should say, by the way, that when we're playing any of these tunes, please feel free to join in. We're not going to sing Scott's original version of Queen's Mary for reasons which I'll explain later. This is a much shortened, curtailed version, partly because the Scott's original version is about 15 verses to it, so we'd be here half the night.
And the buses finish at 11:30, so... Yes, stream the Queen had 4 Marys, the night shall hae but 3. And there was Mary Seaton and Mary Beaton, Mary Carmichael and me. Now word's gone to the kitchen, word's gone to the hall, that Mary Hamilton's wee child by the highest steward of all. Yes, stream the Queen had 4 Marys, the night shall hae but 3. There was Mary Seaton and Mary Beaton, Mary Carmichael and me. Oh, often I dressed my Queen, put gold in her hair, but now I've gotten my reward,
gallows to be my share. Yestreen the Queen had 4 Marys, the night shall hae but 3. There was Mary Seaton and Mary Beaton, Mary Carmichael and me. Oh, little did my mother think when first she cradled me, the lands I was to travel in, or the death that I was to die. Yestreen the Queen had 4 Marys, the night shall hae but 3. There was Mary Seaton and Mary Beaton, Mary Carmichael and me. There was Mary Seaton and Mary Beaton, Mary Carmichael and me.
Thank you very much. Queen's Mary was first collected and published in Minstrelsy of the Scottish Border. It's the first time we know of that the kind of something closest to the version that is now popular was published. Child collected 28 different fragments of Mary Hamilton. It's ballad 173 in Child, which is one of the larger numbers of fragments that he collected of any song. Scott claims to have created the Queen's Mary from a variety of sources, but cites his friend Mr. Kirkpatrick Sharp, who I think lived at Hodham Castle over in Galloway, as the main source of the version which he set down in the minstrelsy. But of course, as you know, Scott's process in creating in the minstrelsy was, at times he just did straight lifts, others it was a more creative thing. Something like Thomas the Rhymer, he had the original and then added a section which was kind of partly him and partly extant, and then another section which was pretty much largely him. And he was trying to, as is the manner in these things, and Burns did the same thing, trying to sort of improve them in his own eyes. But he later said in 1825, when he was writing to William Motherwell, "I think I did myself wrong in endeavouring to make the best possible set of an ancient ballad out of several copies obtained from different quarters, and that in many respects, if I improved the poetry, I spoiled the simplicity of the old song."
In terms of the story behind Mary Hamilton, and there's all sorts of tales out there, but it's basically seems to be a conflation of 2 different stories. Mary Queen of Scots was known to have 4 ladies in waiting, all called Mary, and one of them was Mary Hamilton. Now, the ballad tends to tell the story of Mary Hamilton having had an affair, given birth to a child and murdering the child, and that's why she's being hanged. But there's also a story from the early 1700s, a true story about a Mary Hamilton who was in the court of Peter the Great, who apparently had an affair with her, and an affair with him, and had a child, murdered the child, and so was executed for it. And actually, there was a story that I heard Simon Sebag Montefiore tell on the radio a couple of weeks ago. He was talking about, I think he'd written a book about bazaars, and he was saying that Mary Hamilton was executed, and Peter the Great went up as she was about to be beheaded, kissed her, and then stood back as her head came off, then picked up her head, showed it to the crowd, pointed out various arteries, etc., kissed it on the lips, put it down and wandered off again, so, which is always a good, says a lot about Peter the Great, perhaps. In the minstrelsy, Scott talks about the story from in Knox's history of the Reformation, where Knox talks about a liaison between a French woman that served in the Queen's chamber who had played the whore with the Queen's own apothecary. Now, Scott himself notes that through the centuries, that kind of changed into the point where it was thought that the apothecary had actually been Darnley, and that the woman in the Queen's chamber was Mary Hamilton. So that's kind of where it came from. In terms of, do you want to flick that one? Yep. Sorry, Marty, unbelievably, is the technical one here.
They didn't know I don't use computers.
Yeah. Do you want to just mention?
Yep. So I mentioned earlier that we were playing a shortened form of it. Of course, it's substantially shortened, the version we've done. And I think this comes back to the idea of the oral tradition, the published song, and coming back again. Jock Hazeldean is the same thing, in the sense that people record versions of it, in America in particular, in the 20th century, as sort of legitimate folk songs. And actually this raises a really interesting question, because those of you that know about, I'm sure most of you do, the classic story of Hogg's mother condemning Scott because he'd ruined the ballads by writing them all down. He'd sort of scuppered them. Those of you that know that will realise that actually there's a much more complex relationship between the oral tradition and written culture than perhaps it might seem. It's not as if everything in the oral culture comes to a juddering halt as soon as people start writing songs down. In fact, what happens is you have Scott who spreads these songs perhaps wider than they maybe would have been spread otherwise in some cases, and then they re-enter the oral tradition and get kind of spat back out, if you like, 100 years later in a slightly different form. But Scott's participating in that even as he's writing stuff down, which I think is a really, the complexity of that I think it fascinates me. But this is another example. In our album Bends of the Bow, the version we did, which is the version we just sang, has the verse, words going to the kitchen, words going to the hoe, that Mary Hamilton's wee child by the highest steward of all. Now, the first two stanzas of Scott's version in the minstrelsy, in fact the first three stanzas, are all about the king looking at Mary Hamilton in church. Mary Hamilton's to the kirk gane wi' ribbons on her hair, the king thought mair of Mary Hamilton than ony that were there. Mary Hamilton's to the kirk gane wi' ribbons on her breast, the king thought mair of Mary Hamilton than he listened to the priest. The third one is about him looking at her gloved hands and talking about how he thought more of Mary Hamilton than all the queen in all her lands. So right there, you've got what Scott does in his version of it, is he's got the time and space to develop it. So you're focusing on the king, and he obviously can't take his eyes off Mary Hamilton when she's in church. And he notices little details about her and notices more about her. And he's got the time to build that. It's about the king's desire, basically. When it comes to the more kind of well-kent version, if you like, the versions that we're doing, the highly truncated ones, that has to get condensed down. And it gets condensed down in this way. Mary Hamilton's wee child by the highest steward of all, that's it, bang. It was the king who did it, is basically how that comes to. And that's how this kind of process has changed. And Scott took it, enlarged these ballads, as he said himself, and possibly lost something in doing so. And the oral tradition has kind of taken it, worked with it, and condensed them all back up again, in some cases.
In terms of the tune, finding tunes for these songs, as Martin was saying earlier, it's the words that we can generally find. Finding the tunes for them is much harder. But for this one, and by the way, if anybody has any information on where the tune that we know now comes from, then we'd love to hear it. I think the closest that we managed to trace was to the US and Texas in the 1950s. But clearly it predated that. Now there's a story which attributes the writing of Mary Hamilton to David Rizzio, Mary Queen of Scots' advisor, and who of course was a musician. Excuse me. Now when we first kind of came across the story, we thought, oh, that's clearly nonsense. But there's perhaps a little clue, because this man here, James Oswald, who published the Pocket Companion, was perhaps arguably Scotland's foremost composer, of the 18th century. Now, he published works under the pen name of David Rizzio, because he was a publisher. He had an eye on the commercial possibilities which were opened up by publishing things with an air of antiquity. So he used the names of kind of dead figures from the past. I think the Clarsack player Rory Dahl, and he wrote Rory Dahl's Sport as well. He published under his name. So there is a possibility that the tune does come from James Oswald, but as I say, that's kind of taking fractions of a story and putting them together. So if anybody has any better information on that, then please let us know.
Since you're in such a role, you may as well carry on. On you go.
Yeah. Also in the minstrelsy, in volume 2, is this ballad, which again, like the Queen's Mary Hamilton, you find many versions. Child's ballad collection in the late 19th century has a whole host, I think 15 different versions which he's collected. Scott's version seems to be the earliest published version of it as Lord Randall, although it appears, courtesy of Burns, in Johnson's Scott's Musical Museum as Lord Ronald. Burns' version is just 2 stanzas, and Burns seemed to have taken it from an old ballad, and had condensed it to this song. Excuse me. Scott says that he changes it from Lord Ronald, as in Burns' version, to Lord Randall. And his idea for that, you can see there, he notes, the hero is more generally termed Lord Ronald, but I willingly follow the authority of an Ettrick Forest copy for calling him Randall, because though the circumstances are so very different, I think it not impossible that the ballad may have originally regarded the death of Thomas Randolph, or Randall, Earl of Murray, nephew to Robert Bruce and Governor of Scotland. This great warrior died at Musselburgh 1332, and he's saying that for a long time his death was attributed to poison. Others have linked it to the death of the 6th Earl of Chester in England. But the point is, this ballad is about somebody being poisoned. And I'll give you a little excerpt of it here. I'll just sing it a cappella, if I can find it here.
Oh, where hae ye been to, Lord Randall, my son? Oh, where hae ye been, my handsome young man? I hae been to the wildwood, Mother Mac my bedsoon, for I'm weary wi' hunting, and fain would lie down. Where gat ye your dinner, Lord Randall, my son? Where gat ye your dinner, my handsome young man? I dined wi' my true love, Mother Mac my bedsoon, for I'm weary wi' hunting, and fain would lie down. What gat ye your dinner, Lord Randall, my son? What gat ye to your dinner, my handsome young man? I got eels boiled in brew, Mother Mac my bedsoon, for I'm weary wi' hunting, and fain would lie down. What became o' your bloodhounds, Lord Randall, my son? What became o' your bloodhounds, my handsome young man? Oh, they swelled and they died, Mother Mac my bedsoon, for I'm weary wi' hunting, and fain would lie down. Oh, I fear ye are poison, Lord Randall, my son. Oh, I fear ye are poison, my handsome young man. Oh yes, I am poisoned, Mother Mac my bedsoon, For I'm sick at the heart, and I fain would lie down.
Now this format, sorry, can you do the this format is found in ballads throughout Europe, dating at least back to 1629. There's a Veronese version entitled "The Poison Man." The Italians call it "L'Avvelenato." But it's always that question and answer format. You know, where have you been? And it comes back. And funnily enough, that then went through into the sort of folk revival. And when Dylan wrote "A Hard Rain's Going to Fall," "A Hard Rains Are Going to Fall" when he was 21, he took the start of Lord Randall and used that as the sort of basis for each stanza. With him, "Oh, where have you been, my blue-eyed son? Oh, where have you been, my darling young one?" And as you may see at the bottom, Burl Ives, no less, claimed that the tune had actually been taken to America by Jacobites in the wake of the 1745. Just a quick little thing about the tune. As we said, Lord Ronald by Burns was in Johnson's Scots Musical Museum in 1792. And Burns said that this air, a very favourite one in Ayrshire, is evidently the original of Loch Aber, and indeed they are almost identical. Now, Loch Aber was first published, the words by Alan Ramsay, in his Tea Table Miscellany about 70 years before that. And Loch Aber was published with the same tune that accompanies Lord Randall or Lord Ronald in the Orpheus Caledonius, 1733. So with that one we have a tune which definitely we can date back to 1733, if not before.
Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about Blue Bonnets over the border. Some people call it March, March, Ettrick and Teviotdale, because that's the first line of the chorus. It appears in chapter 25 of Scots the Monastery. It's sung to the hero in the hall of the brutal Baron Avenel, supposedly in 1549. He's just thrown the heroine to the ground and cut her head like the beast he is. In the process, then sent a priest to the dungeon, so the song is an attempt at distraction. So what he says, Baron Avenel, is, "What ho, my masters, are you border riders, and sit as mute over your meal as a mess of monks and friars? Someone sing if no one lists to speak." And the command is answered by the youngest of his retainers, Lewis, who sang the following ditty to the ancient air of Blue Bonnet over the border. Blue Bonnets over the border. By the way, when we're singing these tunes, if you want to join in, please do. By preference, we'd have the audience singing.
2, 3. Oh, the Blue Bonnets
are over the border, march, march, Edric and Teviotdale, why, lads, then you march, forward in order, march, march, Eskdale and Liddesdale, oh, the Blue Bonnets are over the border.
Beneath a banner spread flutters above your head, beneath the crest that is famous in story. Mountain make ready then, sons o' the mountain glen, fight for the king and the old Scottish glory.
March, march, Ettrick and Teviotdale, why, lads, then you march, forward in order, march, march, Eskdale and Liddesdale, oh, the Blue Bonnets are over the border. Come by the hills where your horses are grazing, come by the glen of the buck and the roe, come to the crag where the beacon is blazing, come with the buckler, the lance and the bow. March, march, Ettrick and Teviotdale, why, lads, then you march, forward in order, march, march, Eskdale and Liddesdale, oh, the Blue Bonnets bonnets are over the border.
Trumpets are sounding, war steeds are bounding.
Stand to your arms then and march in good order.
England shall many a day speak o' the bloody fray.
When the blue bonnets come over the border, march, march. Ettrick and Teviotdale, why, my lads, then you march. Forward in order, march, march. Eskdale and Liddesdale, oh, the blue bonnets are over the border. March, march, Ettrick and Teviotdale, why, my lads, then you march. Forward in order, march, march. Eskdale and Liddesdale, oh, the blue bonnets are over the border. Oh, the blue bonnets are over the border.
Thank you very much. Now, after that song is performed in the novel, Scott's narrator makes the comment, the song, rude as it was, had in it that warlike character which at any other time would have roused Halbert's spirit, but clearly, having just seen the girl thrown to the ground, he wasn't having any of it. It's an interesting book. If any of you haven't read The Monastery, it's a very curious book among Scots, I think, because there's an element of fantasy about it. And although some people would argue there's an element of fantasy about many of Scott's novels. But I also particularly like the fact that the hero is named after a weapon, which is not normal. So, the ancient air that Scott claims in the novel, he claims it's ancient in the mid-16th century, is a parody of Leslie's March. This was a song which Chambers attributed in the mid-19th century to some sneering cavalier concerning General Alexander Leslie marching his covenanting forces to Marston Moor. And I think the interesting thing about this is whether Scott is deliberately muddying the origins of the song by kind of implying that his verse is the original. But then Thomas Seacombe, in the 1920 Centenary Articles collection, was talking about the sort of the way that Scott's often accused of playing fast and loose with history, and also of just coming up with quotes which may or may not be accurate for the start of his chapters. And he said, I think, put it quite beautifully, perhaps we are all rather inclined to go to our memory for our jests and to our imaginations for our facts. However, the song on which Blue Bonnets seems to be based, the lyric anyway, is General Leslie's Marched Along Marston Moor, Alan Ramsay's Tea Table Miscellany in 724, though Scott suggests it was the Evergreen, but it's from the Tea Table Miscellany. Leslie's March was included in the minstrelsy, unchanged. He doesn't change anything about it, it's exactly as it's listed by Ramsay. James Hogg includes Ramsay's version as well in his Jacobite Relics of 1819, but Hogg adds a parody. Hogg, by the way, who I came across a thing today in Scott's journal, Scott referred to as an honest grunter, which I thought was slightly harsh. But anyway, Hogg adds a parody, whether by him or by another hand, I'm not sure, of General Leslie's March to Scotland, which seems suspiciously close to Scott's Blue Bonnets in the metrical structure of it. This is Leslie's March as Ramsay did it. I've missed out the last third of it. You can see where some of the lines come in. March, march, why the devil do you not march? Stand to your arms, my lad, fight in good order. These are all lines which Scott borrowed when he was creating Blue Bonnets. But you can see when you get a little further down, the Parliament's blithe to see us a coming, when to the kirk we come, we'll purge at ilka room frae popish relics and asic innovation, that the world may see, there's nane in the right but we. That is presumably where Chambers gets the sneering cavalier from. But that is where Scott seems to have lifted many aspects of it, but Scott's rhythms are slightly different. This is Hogg's version, that Hogg's parody, Leslie's March to Scotland, which is much more brutal. he's taken the edge that Leslie's March had and amplified it. So the first verse is, March, March, pinks of election. A pinky is a person of small intelligence, the Scots Dictionary tells us. March, March, pinks of election, why the devil don't you march onward in order? March, March, dogs of redemption, ere the blue bonnets come over the border. Now this is 1819. The monastery is published in 1820. Which came first? It's an interesting one. Or is there another source, which I'm not aware of, which is a border source, which is actually what Scott is referring to, and they're both nodding to in those kind of rhythms. So I'll leave you talk about the tune.
Yeah. As for the music, there are two sources thought to be behind it. General Leslie's March itself, and this was published actually in 1862, so after Scott, but by Robert Chambers in his book Songs of Scotland prior to Burns. And that's the one, March, March, why the deal dinna you march. But this other one on the right hand side, Oh Dear Mother, What Shall I Do, or sometimes called Oh Dear Minnie, is a tune with a really old pedigree. Variations on it appeared in The Gentle Shepherd by Ramsay, Patty and Peggy, and in the Caledonian Pocket Companion, Oswald's book. And I think I've highlighted on the General Leslie's March the two notes which are most reminiscent of the tune we sing now. But I think the other one is much more close, and I'll just play a little snippet. So the one on the left there, General Leslie's March, which is in the right timing and so on, starts off, oops, it isn't. So it starts off okay, and then turns into Down at the Old Bull and Bush, that Cockney favourite. Whereas, Oh Dear Mother, Oswald actually published this twice. He published it originally as a slow 3/4 ballad, a very slow one at Largo, in the first volume of the Pocket Companion, and then he reworked it for the third volume. And he's credited with, well, he did rework it into a kind of brisker 6/8 jig, which is much more reminiscent. So the tune, if I just play a little bit of the other tune, you might be able to see a little bit more of Blue Bonnets in it. Okay, so that's the first line there. So we have, I think there, a bit more of a kind of direct link to the tune for Blue Bonnets as we know it now.
Okay, so now I'm going to move on to talk a little bit about Jock of Hazeldean. I'm aware that the wine won't drink itself, so I'll try and speed this along a little bit more. There's a note by Lockhart in 1841, but he says that the first stanza of the poem's ancient, the others were worked up by Scott for Mr. Campbell's Albine Anthology. In fact, Jock of Hazeldean appears alongside 6 others by Scott in Albine's anthology, and I think it's worth giving it its full title for its full dignity. Albine's anthology are a select collection of the melodies and vocal poetry peculiar to Scotland and the Isles, hitherto unpublished, collected and arranged by Alexander Campbell, author of the History of Poetry in Scotland, a journey through the different parts of Scotland, etc., etc. The modern Scottish and English verses adapted to the Highland, Hebridean and Lowland melodies, written by Walter Scott, Esquire, and other living poets of the first eminence, Volume 1.
I love the fact that he thought to put etc., etc. in one part of the title.
Some ancient stanzas, this is Jock of Hazeldean, as I was mentioning. Some stanzas had been collected by 20th century researchers in the Appalachians. And for some people this is proof that the original was carried to the Appalachians by a different family. But the original also appears as John of Hazelgreen in Child and other places. So I don't think it's as simple as that. I certainly don't think you can use the oral history as proof to rule Scott out of the equation. For me, it rules him in, actually. But as I said, it's Child Ballad 293, John of Hazelgreen. There's a Jock of O Hazelgreen and a Jock o' Hazeldean, which all appear there. So, as was said, that the first verse was ancient. This was Scott writing to one of the Miss Clefanes of Mull in 1816, asking them to give a hand, basically, to Thomas Campbell, Archibald Campbell rather, who was doing his research at the time. I wish you very much to give him your advice and assistance in his labours, that is, if you approve of what he has already done. He is a thoroughbred musician and can take down music readily from hearing it sung. Some of his tunes are really very prettily arranged, and I am beginning to give him words for them. One tune I am quite enjoué about. It is decidedly an old Scottish air, but is entirely new to me. The only words which were remembered by the young woman, a Miss Pringle, who sang it were these. I write them down that I may know if you have heard them. And it's a straight lift for the first. So that's what he had when he was working up Jock of Hazeldean. Ronnie Renton of this parish mentions that it's an identical setup to the cross-border romance that he had in Scott's earlier Young Loch and Var. But there, the eventually triumphant lover's the focus. And his fidelity, courage and commitment to his love are explicitly highlighted by the narrator in the first two verses. The poem's first verse is really well known. Young Loch and Vars come out of the west, through all the wide border his steed was the best. And save his good broadsword, he weapons had none. He rode all unarmed and he rode all alone. So faithful in love and so dauntless in war, there never was knight like the young Loch and Var. In the later lyric, as you'll hear in a second if you don't know it, Jock of Hazeldean, there's much more ambiguity over the intent of the father. Is he offering consolation? He says, let these wilful tears be done, which suggests that he's bullying the girl, basically. Or is he trying to offer her consolation? And also, in Jock of Hazeldean, you never meet young Frank or Jock. You're left, like the addressee of the poem, like the girl is being addressed, wondering if the father's telling the truth about young Frank. And also, as I've said there, that you have to think what a catch young Jock must be if he's better than this guy that has everything. And I think earlier, in other versions of Jock of Hazeldean, John of Hazelgreen and such like, in fact, Frank and Jock are the same person. So when she goes home, agrees to marry young Frank, who isn't called Frank in the other versions, it turns out that actually the youngest son is the guy that she's in love with in the first place, which is all terribly satisfying ending. In terms of the oral tradition, I'll just bash through this quickly. The familiar tune is collected in modern New Brunswick. Again, it's another one that made it across the Atlantic, because of course Scott was very popular in North America. But in Britain, when you look at the oral tradition, you get a recording from Mary Robbie near Fraserburgh in 1960. Clearly, that's not the origin of the song. Campbell had collected both tune and first verse from Miss Pringle in Jedburgh in late 1815. And the tune subsequently published in Albion's anthology as a border melody. Bronson traces it via Glenn's early Scottish melodies to Playford's new lessons on the guitar. The guitar is like an early version of the guitar from 1652, where it was listed as Lashley's March and appears in various songbooks, until Campbell kind of rediscovers it when researching for Albion's anthology, except he's rediscovering a tune that everyone knows, or at least has been published many times before. So, I think we'll give you a little bit of Jock of Hazeldean before we go on any further. I'm pretty sure some of you all know this one, so you have to join in. Think of the joy it will give you not to have to listen to me sing.
Why weep ye by the tide, lady? Why weep ye by the tide? Oh, wed ye to my youngest son, and ye shall be his bride. Ye shall be his bride, lady, sae comely to be seen. But I she loot the tears do fall for Jock of Hazeldean. Now let this wilful grief be done, and dry your cheeks sae fair. Young Frank is chief of Wellington, and Lord of Langleydale. His step is first in halls of peace, his sword in battle keen. But I she loot the tears to fall for Jock o' Hazeldean. A band of gold you shall no want, nor braid to bind your hair, nor mettled hound, nor managed hog, nor palfrey fresh and fair. And ye, the foremost of them all, shall ride her forest queen. But I she loot the tears do fall for Jock o' Hazeldean. And the kirk was decked at morning tide, the tapers glimmered fair, the priest and bridegroom wait the bride, and day and night are there. They sought her bathed by bower and hall, the lady wasna seen. She's o'er the border and the wall, wee Jock o' Hazeldean. I o'er the border and the wall, wee Jock o' Hazeldean.
Thank you. So, our last song that we're going to talk about tonight is Bonnie Dundee. It's written on the 22nd of December 1825, Thursday. I happen to know. And we know this because it's recorded in Scots Journal. First published in the Christmas box in 1828. Subsequently included, as I mentioned, with an extensive historical note in the Doom of Devergoyle in 1830. One of the characters in that claims to have ridden with Dundee 30 summers since, so this is an excuse for putting it in. And the Doom of Devergoyle was originally written in about 1818, I think, and sort of another one of his Waverleys that were put away in a drawer. But obviously, he must have had an excuse. He found an excuse to resurrect it, so he gave the 30 summers since the connection, so he could include what is a great song. Scots Journal on the 22nd of December says, "My bile is quite gone. I really believe it arose from mere anxiety. What a wonderful connection between mind and body. The air of Bonnie Dundee running in my head today. I wrote a few verses to it before dinner, taking the keynote from the story of Claver's leaving the Scottish Convention of Estates in 1688-9. I wonder if they are good." It's one of the great understatements of Scottish popular culture. There is a little of Big Bow Wow about it, which of course relates to his opinion on his novels, the idea of the Big Bow Wow strain. Then he says, "Can't say what made me take a frisk so uncommon of late years as to write verses of free will. I suppose the same impulse which makes birds sing when a storm seems blown over. In light of what we now know, that seems is absolutely heartbreaking." So, the day before, Scott had written, this is presumably the cause of his bile, "Dined with James Ballantyne. Cadell and Constable are confident of their making their way through the storm, and the impression of their stability is general in London. I hear the same from Lockhart. Indeed, I now believe that they wrote gloomy letters to Constable, chiefly to get as much money out of them as they possibly could, but they had well nigh overdone it." But sadly, unfortunately, as you all know, by just under a month later, he gets back to Edinburgh. "Came through cold roads to his cold news. Hurst and Robinson have suffered a bill of £1,000 to come back in Constable, which I suppose infers the ruin of both houses. We will soon see. Dined with the Skeens." Skeen's memories state that when he saw Scott that night, Scott said to him, "Skene, this is the hand of a beggar." And he'd said to Skene as well that the night before, when they'd been dining, he had never seen Scott in better spirits. But I think it's not surprising in some ways when he says in his journal entry for the time when he wrote the piece, he thinks he's just escaped, basically. And then he writes, as he said, on a frisk, these verses, which are this great song of defiance, which is, I'm still here, you can't get me, kind of thing. I'll do it, I'll stand up and take you all on. It's this kind of, it's a remarkable song for that. And I think you can see, in part at least, where the impetus to say that, or that mood came from, because he thinks he escaped. It was misguided, as it turns out, as indeed it was for Bonnie Dundee. So, I want to have a little chat about the tune.
Scott quotes three sources for the tune in a letter: Jockey's Escape from Dundee, 1719, Scots Callan of Bonnie Dundee, and Bonnie Dundee, which was in the Beggar's Opera. Now, although Scott didn't know it, there was the kind of origin of those songs was in A Jew Dundee, which was in the Skene manuscript that Martin mentioned at the start, which was bequeathed to the Faculty of Advocates here in Edinburgh in 1818, roundabout, but wasn't worked on, wasn't really gone into until after Scott's death. And actually William Donny, who talks about this and published the manuscript, and noted that he kind of rused the fact that it didn't become, it wasn't kind of discovered during Scott's time, because he says, what would Scott have made of this? This would have been great. But it was kind of thought to have been from around 1615 to 1630, around about that. And it's got A Jew Dundee in that. Scott's journal, about a week after he writes Bonnie Dundee, says, Sir Adam Ferguson came over and tried to marry my verses to the tune of Bonnie Dundee. They seem well adapted to each other. Now here we have Jockey's Escape from Dundee. These three tunes that Scott mentions are all very similar. And this one, it's quite interesting to, I'm just going to play a little section and you can see if you can marry the verses yourself.
It's a much more sad, melancholic tune, Escape from Dundee.
These, all three of these tunes were in a minor key, whereas when Scott wrote it, he then said, well, I want it to be, I think, a military, he said. He wanted it to be a real strident thing. So that little section there, you can imagine him, come fill up my cup, come fill up my can, saddle my... I can't sing that high. Horses and call out my men. So you can see a little element of where it came from, but of course it then changed into the version we know now, which is much more strident and in a major key. So when did that happen? Well, it's first published with the words, the current tune that we know is first published in David Jack's Lyric Gems of Scotland in 1856. And the tune is attributed to Charles Dalbert, who was a German composer who lived in Scotland. His son Eugene actually was brought up in Glasgow and became a great friend of Liszt later on. But Dalbert writes the Bonnie Dundee quadrille, and that has the tune. And we know that that's first available in 1856 as well. I found a note from the Sydney Morning Herald on the front page, an advert saying new music available, the Bonnie Dundee quadrille, so we can date it. Certainly it was available in Australia in June 1856. So that's where this original tune comes from.
I think, given that time is marching on, and if there is a question that you'd like to ask, it's probably why haven't you stopped speaking yet? So I'm just going to leave that. This is from Scott's own note. In The Doom of Devergoyle, he gives a huge historical note that he lifts from Dalrymple's Memoirs of Great Britain and Ireland. I think it's really interesting because you can hear how aspects of this particular account of Dundee leaving the Convention of the States come out. So I'll just leave that up there while we're singing it, I think. And we'll call it a day after we've sung it. But we're going to try and sing the whole of Scott's version of Bonnie Dundee. So hope you've not got buses by 9. We'll be fine. It's full music, it'll be fine.
Or your voice.
A little bit accurate and low.
To the Lords of Convention 'twas cleavers who spoke, "Ere the King's crown shall fall, there are crowns to be broke. So let each cavalier who loves honour and me come follow the bonnets of Bonnie Dundee. Come fill up my cup, come fill up my can, come saddle your horses and call up your men, and rule the Westport and let me go free. And it's room for the bonnets of Bonnie Dundee. Dundee is mounted, he lights up the street. The bells are rung backwards, the drums they are beat. But the Provost whose man says just let him be. The good tune is we'll quit all that deal of Dundee.
As he rode down the sanctified winds on the bow, Bill Carline was flighting and shaking her paw. But the young plants of grace, they looked goody and slee, thinking luck to thy bonnet, thou Bonnie Dundee.
Come fill up my cup, come fill up my can, come saddle your horses and call up your men, and rule the Westport and let me gang free. And there's room for the bonnets of Bonnie Dundee. At White's the grass market was crammed, as if half all the West had said tryst to be hanged. There was fear in each look, there was doubt in each eye, as they watched for the bonnet of Bonnie Dundee.
These kills o' Kilmarnock had spits and had spears, and lang-hafted gullies to kill cavaliers. But they shrunk to close heads and the causeway was free, and a toss o' the bonnet of Bonnie Dundee.
Come fill up my cup, come fill up my can, come saddle your horses and call up your men, and rule the Westport and let me go free. And it's room for the bonnets of Bonnie Dundee. He spurred to the foot of the Black Castle rock, and with the gay Gordon he gallantly spoke, that comes Megan her marrow speak 12 words of thee, for the love of the bonnet of Bonnie Dundee.
The Gordon demands of him which way he goes, where shall direct me the shade of my prose. Your grace in short space shall hear tidings o' me, and aglow lies the bonnet of Bonnie Dundee.
Come fill up my cup, come fill up my can, come saddle your horses and call up your men, and rule the Westport and let me gang free. And it's room for the bonnets of Bonnie Dundee. There are hills beyond Pentland and lands beyond Forth, be the lords in the south, there are chiefs in the north, but as fine Danny was, he'll 3,000 times 3, cry hey for the bonnets of Bonnie Dundee.
There's brass on the target o' bark and bull hide, there's steel in the scabbard that dangles beside. The brass shall be burnished, the steel shall flash free, and a toss o' the bonnet o' Bonnie Dundee.
Come fill up my cup, come fill up my can, come saddle your horses and call up your men, and rule up the Westport and let me gang free. And it's room for the bonnets of Bonnie Dundee. So to the hills stay, the cliffs stay, the rocks, ere I own a usurper I'll couch with the fox, and tremble false wigs in the midst of your glee. I have no seen the last of my bonnets, or you don't now. Come fill up my cup, come fill up my can, come saddle your horses and call up your men, and rule the Westport and let me gang free. And it's room for the bonnets of Bonnie Dundee.
waved his proud hand and the trumpets were blown. The kettle drums crashed and the horsemen rode on. On Ravelston's cliffs and on Clarmiston's lea died away the wild war notes of bonny Dundee.
That splendid rendition of Bonnie Dundee was a wonderful way to end. It is our convention to ask questions, but perhaps that would lead to too much of an anticlimax. But if anybody has a burning question,
you know the answers.
If anybody has a burning question, now's your moment. Just one at the back from Eric.
Yes, I think it's absolutely uplifting anyway, and it's totally subversive, historical, and how to get Dundee and Edinburgh in one song, I don't know. Anyway, the point is, you gentlemen, you teach in the next generation, because 60 years ago we were subjected to BBC Scotland wonderful folk songs, and the Power Marys, the Queens and Power Marys was reported. It's just such a embedded, and only with a memory, music triggers memories more than we would really know. So I hope you're giving them words more than memories in the syllabus of Scotland today for the young lot who don't know this at all.
Yeah, well, funnily enough, there is now obviously in primary schools, which is what I'm familiar with, there's a lot of focus on Burns, but I have tried in my own way to, spread it out from Burns and talk about the origins of these songs, and the fact that Ramsay's responsible, that Scott's responsible, all these other people in addition to Burns, because I think there is a tendency, there's so much focus on Burns now that you ask any 8-year-old and they'll be able to tell you who Robert Burns was, and one or two facts about him, and probably recite a couple of lines, but it seems to, in my experience, it seems to end there. So it is about doing that, as you say, kind of getting these songs out. And children love singing them. They love singing these. You can imagine doing, albeit a shorter version of Bonnie Dundee to a classroom of sort of 10-year-olds. They're like, oh, come fill up my cup. They're absolutely loving it.
They do. We do concerts in some of the schools actually, and it's great. The kids absolutely love it. They really see. They're so chipper about it. It's brilliant.
The one connectivity bit is, and I just can't resist this, is you put in a wee line there for Bob Dylan. Well, what's not mentioned is this. Bob Dylan at that very time was going through quite a crush on the wonderful singer Joan Baez. He did her own rendition.
Mary Hamilton.
Yes, that's true.
The Irish, the Scots, the Appalachians, and round full circle. Great.
I think it's amazing you've covered the ground you have, although we've slightly overrun. But the complexities of this, it's a world we have lost. These tunes are all over the place in Scottstown. And the challenge to write or adapt words to them was there for all authors. And also it's one of the things in terms of the audience, one of the few things that period which united the ordinary people with the upper ranks. It's an amazing world which we've lost contact with, and you were very correctly bringing back to life for us, and we're very welcome. Before we close, our next talk, and we have the vote of thanks, our next talk is on the 18th of May, a month from now. It'll be on titled In the Tracks of Morality, by Ian Wilson, and it's based on his book about Robert Patterson, the prototype of Scots old mortality, a real-life stonecutter who travelled around the west of Scotland restoring Covenanters' graves. And this will be preceded by the club's AGM, which will commence at 7 o'clock then. And now I'd like to call on Alistair Hutton to offer our vote of thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Peter. Walter Scott's best known now for his great novels, and only slightly less for his long narrative poems. He had a very good ear for the rhythm of words, which shows clearly in his poems, and his earliest ventures into print were verses, first of his creation, and then the songs and the ballads with which he'd been assiduously collecting along the border for several years. Indeed, it's plain that his earliest poetic creation had been inspired by the music of the old ballads he'd been hearing as he gathered them in. Scott was at the cusp when the fruits of the old Scottish oral tradition were being written down. Robert Burns' mother, and as Martin rightly said, James Hogg's mother, and no doubt countless others, greatly disapproved of this practice of writing down the old Scots verses which people had known by heart for centuries, believing that it robbed them of the essential vitality of the ways in which they were told. But without the work of Scott and Burns before him, it's very likely that we wouldn't now have a fraction of the old Scots creations that we do, and we owe Sir Walter Scott a great debt. And tonight we owe the Sorries a great debt for bringing some of these old songs to life for us. We thoroughly enjoyed the rich combination of the stories, the songs and the music, and I'd be very glad if you'd join me in saying a very warm thanks to Martin, Philip and Douglas Kay for a fascinating and thoroughly enjoyable evening. Thank you.
There's just one further thing I'd be nice to mention. This is a newspaper special issue about the Scott bicentenary affairs that took place in 1971. That's when some of us, including myself, came in on this business, and I'll put it outside on on a table where we have the canapes and drinks later if anybody wants to look at it.